everybody. Generally speaking, people in the ancient world received their religion and their culture from their homeland. For example, the Greeks had their gods, the Babylonians had their gods. The Roman Empire was relatively tolerant of religious pluralism. Practically, a level of religious toleration was necessary in a large empire that consisted of many different ethnic and religious groups. However, regardless of religious affiliation, the people under Roman rule were expected to honor the gods of the empire, venerate the emperor, and offer up prayers to the Roman gods for the empire's well-being. This was a requirement for being a good citizen, and with the exception of the Jewish people, few people actually took issue with this. Many faiths in the ancient world were polytheist, so while someone had their favorite gods or their patron god, this did not preclude them from recognizing other gods of other nations. It was assumed that other gods were real, and it was quite possible to offer sacrifice to another god while staying loyal to your own. Judaism, of course, was the exception to this. However, Roman authorities did recognize Judaism as an old and venerable religion, and Jews were exempt from the requirement of sacrificing to the Roman gods for the most part. This stops after the Jewish War, which starts in the year 66. The temple is destroyed in the year 70. So, for the first few decades after Jesus' death, Romans could not distinguish Judaism from Christianity, and Christians reaped the benefits of not being expected to sacrifice either. However, Christians developed new communities, which were comprised of both Jews and Gentiles, and Christians continued to distinguish themselves from their Jewish roots. Rome and its people came to realize that Christianity was something different, something new, and something suspect. This suspicion was compounded by the somewhat secret nature of the religion, the language Christians used to describe their worship. The government and the people began to be very, very suspicious of Christians. There were rumors of cannibalism due to the language used around the Eucharist, and rumors of incest, which I talked about the other day. An additional charge that was hurled at them was that of an atheist. All right, this seems odd, but Christians were denying the existence of all the other gods besides their own, or maybe even worse, accusing the other gods of being demons. All right, so up on the screen, I have a picture of Nero. The first large-scale killing of Christians occurred in the year 64 CE, after the Great Fire of Rome destroyed much of the city. Nero found it useful to blame the unpopular Christians for setting the fire, thus diverting negative public opinion from himself to this group. It is estimated that hundreds of Christians were killed, and according to the letter of First Clement, both Peter and Paul were executed in this purge. This was obviously terrible, but the event was more of an isolated slaughter than any sort of systematic persecution. All right, for today, you read this letter between Trajan and Pliny. It describes the policy of Rome through much of kind of the first 300 years, all right? The idea that you are not to seek out Christians, but if they're accused, you have to try and execute them or punish them, all right? With a policy like this, violence towards Christians was generally localized and sporadic. The state did not engage in any sort of systematic persecution, at first at least, but local populations may have. Some of the earliest martyrdoms include Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, who died around the turn of the 2nd century, though there is no account of his actual death. Polycarp is a pretty famous early martyr who died in the mid-2nd century as an old man, kind of demonstrating great courage and strength. This is one of the more famous martyrdom accounts. In the year 161, Marcus Aurelius became emperor. His tenure as emperor is plagued by various disasters, and despite being a very educated person, he blamed the Christians for bringing the wrath of the gods onto the empire. He has supported the persecution of Christians and martyrs, including both Justin Martyr and a woman named Felicitas, who watched her 7 sons be martyred before she was martyred herself, are included in this particular persecution. This round of persecution ends with his death in the year 180. All right, now up on the screen, I have a picture of Perpetua and Felicity. By the beginning of the 3rd century, the political situation for Christians grew worse again. Roman rule started showing signs of decline, while Christianity continued to spread amongst the ranks of Roman society. Emperors wanting to instill greater loyalty in their subjects, and that heightened suspicion of Christians. Under the rule of Septimus Severus, a large-scale persecution was started around the turn of the 3rd century. This was the wave that took the lives of Perpetua and Felicity. One of your Moodle discussion options is looking at this martyrdom tale along with the Acts of Thecla, but I want to highlight a few things here that might not be immediately apparent to you when you read this account. First, scholars really do think that this account was written by Perpetua, or at least the bulk of it. There is a fairly widely accepted theory that the editor of the text was actually Tertullian, one of the very early influential church fathers, which we talked about earlier. Okay, this is one of the only writings in the early church by a woman. All right, so if nothing else, it's important for that matter, but it is a really good detailed account of martyrdom. And a few things are worth noting. Both women are mothers. Many martyrdom accounts are about virgins, and over time that becomes increasingly the case. But in here, Perpetua and Felicity's motherhood is very much on display in this account, and it isn't seen as a negative. Oftentimes you'll hear Felicity being referred to as Perpetua's slave. I do not see any indication in the text that this is true, though it is clear that Felicity is a slave. Their husbands are curiously missing. There has been a ton of speculation on Perpetua's husband. Throw it into the ATLA database. There's lots of articles on this. So the text clearly states she is married, though he never shows up. Historians have wondered whether she was widowed, whether one of the other people in prison was her husband. We don't know. But the relationship with her father is very interesting. She is really subverting culture by refusing to listen to her father, who is considered her authority. Felicita's situation is also unexplained. As a slave, she wouldn't have normally had any control over her own child. She wouldn't have been allowed to be married either, actually. However, her owner does not show up at all. It is noted that her child is adopted by a Christian woman who seems to be a free Christian woman, so her daughter likely will grow up free, which would not actually normally be the case. So that must have been a huge relief to Felicitas. So the two women are sentenced to public death, but they die on their own term as heroes in the arena. Okay, and that is what makes this account so powerful, and what made these martyrdom accounts so powerful in the early church. The government can oppress them, they can kill them, but they can't destroy them or the faith. It's kind of this ultimate act of rebellion against this empire. All right. And there is an equality in these deaths. Men and women die side by side in the arena, both exhibiting incredible bravery. This becomes a symbol to early Christians. All right. So some of these folks were very eager to die. In fact, there's writings kind of telling people not to seek out martyrdom. This is like a real thing. People were ready to die for Jesus Christ, though of course not everybody wanted to. I mentioned last time Origen's mother had to hide his clothes because he was so enthusiastic about becoming a martyr in the church. So in the early church, what we can take away, Christianity had a very high cost. What does that mean? Well, we aren't getting, folks that show up just on Easter and Christmas, all right? Knowing you could be tortured and killed for your faith makes the believers very, very serious about their faith. So what will it mean when Christianity becomes legal? That's next week, but just something to think about a little bit. All right, kind of wrapping up here, martyrdom in the Roman Empire. After the wave that took Perpetua and Felicity, there was another persecution under the reign of Decius that began in the year 250. 8 years later, Valerian renewed the efforts. The final wave of severe persecution began under Galerius in the eastern part of the empire and Diocletian in the west at the end of the 3rd century. This would be the final persecution in the Roman Empire. All right. However, while the 4th century brought an end to the persecutions for Christians living under Roman rule, the opposite is actually true for Christians living under Persian rule. In fact, in the Persian Empire, what is remembered as the Great Persecution began around the year 340 under the Persian Shah of Shahs, Shapur II. It's somewhat ironic, but the favored position of Christianity in Rome led to the persecutions in Persia. Let me give you a little background. Rome and Persia were frequently at war, and there was this deep, deep distrust between the empires. So when Emperor Constantine sends the Shah of Shah a letter asking him to protect the Christians in his realm, well, the Shah gets super suspicious and starts associating the Persian Christians with Roman enemies, thus leading to the Great Persecution and a desire to turn back to the traditional religion of the empire, Zoroastrianism. By the 5th century, Christians were largely freer to worship in peace, though the major exception was the nobility or the Zoroastrian clerics. The penalty for converting for them was very steep, generally death. Like in Rome, martyrdom in Persia became a major expression of the faith.